Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What is it about America that makes it number one in the world for death by gun? Let's get to the bottom line. Before the coronavirus hit, before the opioid epidemic, before many other invisible killers, another epidemic has ravaged America for generations, and that's extreme violence towards each other and an inability to bring guns under control. The United States is the only country in the world that has more guns than people. If you live in America today, you can buy a fast-action assault rifle that's been battle-tested in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Most of the time, people owning guns is not the problem. Hunters like to hunt. Millions of people believe that having a gun keeps them safer. And there's a line in the United States Constitution, and it gives people the right to possess private weapons. Tie those guns to human nature's tendency towards violence, even more intense in America today, given the heat generated by deep racial and economic divides, and America comes out on top as one of the most violent and most likely to die by gun nations in the world. My guest today has been wrestling with this complicated and emotional debate head on for the past 8 years. He is Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and he's just published a deep and heartfelt book on the issue, The Violence Inside Us. Senator Murphy, thank you so much for joining us. So I've read your book, and this book starts out with a story of yourself, essentially in school, challenging another boy to a duel of sorts with fists. And I was fascinated by this because I reflected on my own moments in school with fist fights. And you said there's more that is going on with guns and violence in America than we are really letting on. Tell us why you started your book this way.
Steve, first of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. People who see me on TV talking about the issue of violence likely think that I think violence begins and ends with the gun. And what I've attempted to do in this book is for people that are curious about why America is such a violent place, tell the whole story. And the story really begins with human nature. It begins with biology. I open with the story of my first fist fight, one that I lost spectacularly in first grade on my school's playground. But, almost every single one of us at some point in our life has had a feeling of rage inside us that causes us to want to hurt someone else. And that's because our instinct for aggression is biological. And so I thought it was important to start the book by recognizing that. And as you now know, the rest of the book, I think, gives a pretty fair presentation about why America has become so violent. I come to the conclusion that much of it is due to a nation that is awash in guns. When you have such easy access to weapons, ordinary arguments that might not end up in death in other countries are lethal. But America is violent for a lot of other reasons. Our racist past, a history bathed in violence, a melting pot of cultures that tend to come in conflict with each other. America has a very unique story, one that probably pointed us in the direction of having more violence than other nations. We just essentially decided to pour kerosene on a smoldering fire by deciding to have the loosest gun laws in the world.
One of the fascinating things about this book, which I highly recommend people read, is how critical you are of yourself, and vignettes where literally Black ministers are screaming at you and saying, it took this incident where white children died to finally get you in to this subject matter. I thought it was very revealing that you put this out about yourself, that Sandy Hook, that other mass murders were what triggered you as a new and brand new U.S. Senator coming in. But what do you think about their statements that all of us have been late to the game with a kind of genocide that's been going on in this country, particularly within the Black community, for a long time?
I've read a lot of political memoirs over the years. This is not a political memoir. It really is a book about American violence, the history and politics of it. But I've tried to be really honest and really open in this book. I think that, what ails politicians today is our inability to be real and authentic. And I've tried to do that here. And so I admit in the book that I was lacking an emotional connection to an issue prior to Sandy Hook, and that I could sense that there was, maybe something missing in my political makeup. That all changed when I met those families in December of 2012. I also admit to being so mortally embarrassed by the fact that I was blind to the reality of what was going on in places like the North End of Hartford. I grew up a stone's throw away from the North End of Hartford. And when I first went there after Sandy Hook, as I describe in the book, those mothers and fathers were furious with me. They said, listen, we grieve for these young boys and girls in Sandy Hook harder than anybody else because we know what it's like to lose their son or a daughter. But why on earth did it take the murder of white kids for you to come to the North End of Hartford and start caring about the murder of black kids? Because before Sandy Hook ever happened, 20 young men and women had died in Hartford by gun wounds this year. My life changed in so many ways in December and January of 2012 and 2013. But I came to realize that the mission of the anti-gun violence movement has to be much broader than just the mass shootings that occupy the news. And I've tried to be true to that. And I try to be true to that in this book.
What is keeping the legislative branch of government from making smarter gun control policies than they're doing now?
Well, I also, Steve, in this book, tell the story of the NRA, the development of one of the most powerful political forces that we have seen in modern politics. And I think you have to understand the power of the NRA to understand why Congress hasn't been able to be moved to action, despite the fact that 90% of Americans want things like universal background checks. The NRA, started off as a really sleepy, pro-gun control organization representing responsible hunters and gun owners. It was transformed in the 1970s to become the leader of a sort of vast right-wing infrastructure whose mission was to destroy government and to oppose any and all government intervention in our lives. And that movement became strong enough such that when Sandy Hook happened, they were ready for us. They were ready for those families. And what we decided that day when we lost the background checks bill that was written by Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey in 2013 was that we were going to build a political movement that was just as strong as theirs. And so, the first half of this book is a story of American violence, the history of it, the development of it, the development of the gun lobby. The back half of this book is a story of our movement and how we built something that is now, I would argue, stronger than the NRA. We beat 30 some odd NRA A-rated members of Congress in 2018. I think we're on the verge of winning control of the Senate. And in 2021, you might finally see that background checks bill pass, which will save thousands of lives in this country because we are going to become a political movement that legislators fear more than they fear the gun lobby.
Do you believe that American citizens have the right to own private arms?
I came to the conclusion, in part through research on this book, that we do. That there is a constitutional right to the private ownership of guns. And this will surprise some people because many of my ilk, many fellow anti-gun violence advocates don't believe that, believe that, in fact, the Second Amendment simply speaks to the ability of militias to organize. And so I spend some time in this book telling the story of the founders' intent on guns and the story of the Second Amendment. And I think this will be really helpful for people. A lot of folks, don't want to get into arguments about gun rights because, they think that their NRA uncle knows more about the Second Amendment than they do. Well, you get a primer in this book on the Second Amendment. And I come to the conclusion that while the Second Amendment is probably mostly about militias and the reality of needing militias to have access to guns, our founding fathers did believe in a common law right to gun ownership. And I just think it's really smart for our movement to acknowledge that and to say, listen, we don't want to take away your guns if you're a law-abiding gun owner. And we actually don't think the Constitution allows for that. And I think if we landed on that ground, we would ultimately be much more successful in finding common ground with some of our opponents.
I think this is a very interesting point. I mean, let me show you in the audience a tweet from the NRA, which says, if Joe Biden wins, he will destroy our Second Amendment and America will become unrecognizable. So the NRA is planting in the minds of people that you and your movement are trying to take guns away from them. Where's the marketing on the other side of that? Do you think you need to go? I mean, you had an encounter with a guy that you share in your book. You said, Donald Trump is trying to, let me keep my gun. You folks are trying to take it away. And you talked it through with him. and you both ended up on the same page. It was a fascinating moment, I thought. Why isn't that becoming, sort of a larger piece of your message?
Well, I think it's important for us to take this head on. And that's why I spend some time in the book discussing the importance of Democrats and advocates of stricter gun laws framing the message before we jump into policy. And I think it is important for us to recognize that there are lots of gun owners out there who think we have an agenda that we don't have, who really think that I believe in gun confiscation. And the reason that I'm for background checks is so that I can get a catalog of everybody's weapons to make it more easy for the government to come snatch them. That, of course, is not true. But I think the argument is stronger if we acknowledge that we don't have the legal ability to do that, even if we wanted to do that. I also explain in the book that while our founders probably believed in a common law right of gun ownership, they also believed in pretty heavy gun regulation. It might surprise some folks who are followers of the president or the gun lobby to know that America had really strict gun control laws on the books during the writing of the Constitution. You had to register your weapons or how much gunpowder you had. There were big portions of the population that weren't allowed to own guns. And so we have a legacy in this country of regulation of firearms that starts with the very people that wrote the Second Amendment.
You wrote this real strong critique of your colleagues about not taking action after incident after incident after incident, even after, when you had members of Congress shot, Steve Scalise, Gabby Giffords. And so I'm interested in whether you feel that we are finally at a moment, or are we going to be continually doing shows like this where we come back and say, wow, there's another notch in the belt, but we did not move the ball forward?
Well, I do think we're at a moment, and I give this speech to anti-gun violence activists all the time, in which I remind them that the great social change movements in this country, the ones that you read about in the history books, are not those that gave up after they met an obstacle or two. They're the organizations and the movements that persevered through failure and failure and failure. And we've had a lot of failures, right? We still haven't passed a meaningful change in our federal gun laws. We've actually had a lot of success at the state level. We've had a lot of success pressuring the private sector to do better. But yeah, we haven't gotten that major anti-gun violence bill passed through Congress. But we got it passed through one house of Congress in 2019. I think that if we win control of the Senate, we will get the votes necessary to pass it through the Senate, and Joe Biden will sign it. So we're there. And it's pretty remarkable that we have come this far in such a short period of time, from 2013, where we couldn't muster votes despite having the majority of the Senate represented by Democrats. I think we're close. And part of the reason that I wrote this book is to give people an entrance point to become more educated activists. I think folks don't want to just know about background checks. They want somebody to explain to them why America is so violent. And that story is a really complicated one. It's not just about guns. It's also about a system of racial oppression. It's also about a desire of many to hold on to certain hierarchies. And I think this book, which is not overwhelming to read, is going to turn a lot of people into much more passionate, much more educated, much more effective activists that will help us get over the hump in 2021.
And what about the fear industry, Senator? About bulletproof backpacks, about, training for, high intensity conflict, the security industry, what we see happening in really the militarization of K through 12 schools in a way. When you look at the defenses and systems going in, are we building a self-fulfilling prophecy to some degree that people are getting addicted to this kind of, predilection for expected violence?
In the book is the story of sort of the immediate moments that I went through after Sandy Hook, and I describe walking out of a funeral, and I can't remember how many of them I went to in Newtown in the weeks following, and seeing the first statement from the NRA. We thought at that moment in the week after Sandy Hook that the NRA was going to come to the table and maybe not be for all the things that I wanted, but at least be constructive. And of course, as we remember now, they took this incredibly hard line. Wayne LaPierre comes out and essentially says the only way to protect our schools is to load our schools up with guns, and that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That was wrong then, and it's wrong today. And well, I don't want to stop anybody from purchasing a gun if they feel they need it to protect themselves or their family. I want to make sure that everybody knows the data. And the data is that if you have a gun in the house, it's 10 times more likely to be used to kill you or to end in a criminal murder committed by you than it is to be used against an intruder who's coming into your house. That's the reality. And so, yes, people buy a lot of weapons because of the things that they fear. And the NRA and the gun industry has done a great job of convincing people that guns will protect them. The reality is those guns tend to end up being used in suicides, in accidental shootings, or in other kinds of homicides, not in protection of you or your family. And people need to know that.
What about the other parts of the ecosystem? Pamela Haag, in her book, The Gunning of America, talked about something you refer to a bit, which is how the gun industry became clever in the way it marketed itself, that it sort of tied this spirit of independence. While the frontier may be disappearing, endowed with the Second Amendment of the Constitution, can take matters in your hand. They used to write, Winchester used to write, the way to be manly is to have a gun, and tying to this. And one of the things I love about your book is how you get into the behavioral dimensions of gun ownership, and you look at at ghettos, you look at gangs, you look at the one-upsmanship, and you tell the story of a young man, Shane Oliver, who tried very hard not to get caught up in that, and then died. And I would love to hear that and hear about these dimensions that you see of particularly guys unable to stand down.
Yeah, I'm a stone's throw away right now from my office here in Connecticut. My office here in Connecticut is in the Colt Firearms Factory. They don't make firearms there any longer, but that is the place that the repeating revolver was invented in the 1800s, which transformed the firearms industry. And shortly thereafter, the sales of those weapons exploded in the United States because we made a decision not to control the ways in which those weapons got into civilian hands. And you are right. From the early days, the gun marketers recognized that they could romanticize the notion of gun ownership, that they could tie it to ideas like individualism and entrepreneurship. And by doing so, they could get a lot of people into the business of buying weapons. But as you also note, I do start this book not with the story of Sandy Hook. This book isn't the story of Sandy Hook. I start this book with the story of Shane Oliver, a young man who didn't make it past the age of 20. His entire life was consumed by violence. He had to learn how to fight at an early age to protect himself. He set up his own water bottle selling business when he was 10 so that he had an excuse as to why he couldn't join the drug gangs. And he got killed over a fight about a girl. It was a fight over a girl. He threw a punch, and the guy he threw a punch at happened to have an illegal weapon in the front seat of his car. He went and grabbed it and killed Shane Oliver just 3 blocks away from where I'm sitting today in Hartford, Connecticut, in my home. And it's important to understand how violence and poverty track each other, that the more economically desperate you are, the more likely you are to be the victim or the perpetrator of violence. And that's been true throughout human history. This book is about changing our gun laws, but it's also about recognizing that if we don't lift up communities that are soaked in economic desperation, which, let's be honest, by and large tends to be communities of color, then you can't escape these cycles of poverty. Shane was killed not just because there was easy access to guns in Hartford, but also because his life as a poor young African American in Hartford was defined by violence from the very beginning.
Right. Senator, you and I know each other, and we've known each other. So I don't agree with what Lawrence O'Donnell said about you, but Lawrence O'Donnell essentially described you as a kind of guy who checked off all the boxes, got it all done right, life of privilege, white guy from rich part of Connecticut, ran for this office, got, kind of bland, unspectacular. And you acknowledge this in the book. then you took an extraordinary risk, and you launched one of the most powerful filibusters in the U.S. Senate with Cory Booker and other people down there on the floor of the Senate with you. I'd love to hear, because part of what I'm wondering whenever I read a book like yours, is your story replicable? Can others find the way through it? Because they don't come packed with all your experiences and knowledge right now. But have you been able to penetrate the rich, the powerful, the ambivalent with something different and move from what Lawrence O'Donnell called you at that moment, from being bland to spectacular? And I want to acknowledge that Lawrence O'Donnell said that you did the spectacular and that you did take a risk.
Yeah, this is sort of one of the more interesting moments of my political career. I come home 2 days after having conducted this filibuster and turn on MSNBC, and there's Lawrence O'Donnell doing a 10-minute monologue on me, in which he makes this point that I'm the least likely person in the world to do something as disruptive as the filibuster. He sort of says, listen, this is a guy who played it safe, who sort of climbed every rung of the ladder, who just showed no signs of being somebody who would take as big a chance as standing by himself on the Senate floor for 15 hours and demanding people listen to him. And I basically say at the end of this book that he's kind of right, that I probably had played it a little bit safer than most, that I probably was wary of taking big chances. And that filibuster, I think, and I hope, is proof that I'm not the same person that I was before I went through the events of late 2012. And I tell the story of texting my wife as I'm standing there getting ready to launch this filibuster. I say, Kath, I think I'm about to make a horrible mistake. I think I'm about to stand up here, take control of the Senate floor, and nobody's going to notice. Of course, that's not what happened. We ended up getting votes on these measures, and those votes helped move the debate forward. And my hope is, yes, that people see my story and decide to take some chances and some risks in their own life to try to save lives. I hope that I show that it's possible.
Real quick, Chris, when foreigners think of America and you're asked what they are most disturbed by, they write down the word guns. You shared that. Do you believe, are you optimistic that that will one day change and they will have other images of their minds about America other than guns?
This was a story from the Obama years that's probably different today. Foreign commentators and watchers of the United States probably would write down Trump, 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 and Trump when asked for the 3 or 4 things that they first think about when they consider the United States. But my point is that our gun violence epidemic is not just about domestic politics. It is also about international politics. Our influence is weakened around the world when people look at America and can't come to grips with why we don't get serious about the carnage on our streets. Our influence has never been simply about the strength of our military. It really has mostly been rooted over the years in the strength of the American model and the strength of our economy, of our democracy, and our compassion for each other. And so I make this argument in one chapter of the book that if you want to fix America's influence in the world, and we're going to have to work really hard at that after Donald Trump is gone, then you have to recognize that a strong, safe America domestically is a big part of what gives us influence in other parts of the world. And guns is a big part of that American project of reclamation.
Well, Senator Chris Murphy, thank you. I want to congratulate you on the publication of your book, The Violence Inside Us. And I will just say, I'll just be blunt, I hope you move this forward, and I hope we get to see a sequel that has a slightly different direction and set of findings in it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? In America, there are just a lot of guns. And there have been horrible mass shootings in schools, houses of worship, movie theaters, department stores, dance clubs, workplaces, and yet Americans just keep buying those guns. There is a constitutional right to own them, no doubt, but not a right to have zero regulation or to buy weapons of war for private purposes. But more and more Americans are now willing to stand up and say, hey, we need background checks. Assault rifles shouldn't be in the streets, and our children shouldn't be having active shooter drills in the 2nd grade. Just maybe this is the moment that Senator Murphy and his fellow lawmakers will finally be able to find a common sense solution to this very American problem that just resists going away. And that's the bottom line.